Good afternoon and welcome back to Mason Speaks. This is Mason here. Today I'm speaking with Mr. Vidar Hokstad. Have I pronounced that right this time? Perfect. Now, so obviously this is the Mason Speaks podcast. So thank you very much for coming on today. It's very kind of you. Did you want to just quickly explain sort of who you are? And obviously you're an author as well as many other things. But do you want to just sort of give a little introduction of yourself?
Sure. So my background is technology first and foremost. So that's what sort of been my career for the last 20 to 5 years. But I've also been writing since I was young, and so finally published a book. And well, it's an interesting combination, but most authors don't get the chance to do it full time. So you know, unless you're lucky and get a massive bestseller, it tends to be a sideline.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. I think as you sort of mentioned before we started recording, it's perhaps in the future maybe it'll be something that you could do full time, but for now definitely it's a thing to do along the side, and I guess that means that you can enjoy it more because it's not your work per se. It's something you can do and enjoy it whilst having a full time job at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, I think that's partly the reason why it's taken me so long before I got around to publishing it. And I think there is a bit of a sort of chicken and egg scenario there where the fact that it is hard to make a living as an author is part of the reason why a lot of people take a long time to publish because I mean, I started writing on my first novel, which is not what I published when I was 15. And in retrospect, that book is never, nobody's ever going to get to see it. It was awful. I never finished it, put it aside, and been sort of writing short stories and stuff like that in the background that I also haven't published for a long time. But then a few years ago, I started, deciding that well, I had time. I should start writing a proper novel again and see how it goes. And I put that aside because I got stuck on some details that I didn't really have the right incentives to, get past. Um, because I didn't need to. I didn't have a deadline. I didn't have a pressing need to finish it, and so I put it aside. And it was first last year again that I finally sort of got to the point where I decided that this was something I wanted to do and finish. And um, you know, the interesting thing is that I spend more time procrastinating about doing this book than it took to write it. Many times more. When I actually sat down and decided, I'm going to get this out, and this is my deadline. It it went very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's got to have a lot to do with sort of self drive and motivation. Because if you've not got a big publisher on your side saying you need to get it done by, next year or what have you, then you need to be able to push yourself to do it. I guess would that be something you'd agree with, or?
Yeah, and I think there's several aspects to that as well. I mean, one thing is that if you're going to self-publish, definitively, nobody's going to push you. But that's kind of true if you're going to a publisher as well. Nobody's going to push you until you're accepted. And getting to that point where you get accepted is very hard. And I feel a lot of or a lot of people that aim for traditional publishing get stuck in that trying to write something that's perfect because getting through getting uh, through with a traditional publisher is incredibly difficult,
Mm.
and it takes an incredibly long time, and that was ultimately what put me off because you have some traditional publishers saying, well, expect a reply within 12 months,
Oh, really? Okay. That's
and you might not get a reply if they're rejecting you, and some of them won't even get back to you. And the even trickier part of that is that many of them really frown on authors that submit their works to multiple publishers because they don't want to suddenly have it stuff retracted after they started looking at it.
mm.
And so you might get rejected and rejected and rejected, and before you know it, you spend 5 years getting rejections on a work that might might not have taken you a lot less than that to write.
Yeah.
Uh, so, when I started looking at it, one of my first decisions was, well, am I looking at publishing? Am I looking at this as art or craft, basically? And I think that's the other big thing that a lot of potential authors struggle with is, well, are you looking to write sort of the next big serious literary novel, or are you looking to sell?
Yeah.
And the people, write because they really would like to write that next big literary success, and more so than caring necessarily about being a bestseller. You hope for both, but and I think there's a very different attitude there. So a lot of people that opt for self-publishing are doing it because they are looking at, well, this more as a business and as a craft and as a, you know, your odds of a big payout as a self-published author is lower, but your odds of getting something is much higher because you have full control.
Yeah, like you said, it's a fairly rigorous sort of process to get through the standard publishing method, which I guess would put somebody off trying to pursue their dream, if you like, of being an author. In the regards to the book itself, now it's a sci-fi. So would you class it as sci-fi or fantasy
Yeah,
or sci-fi?
yeah, sci-fi, yes, and pretty hard sci-fi. So there are stuff there that's not scientifically plausible, but I kept that a minimum. So it's definitively towards the harder end with lots of descriptions of details of the science and the setting that it's in. Because that's what I tend to enjoy to read myself as well. And so it's nearish future set in 2145, where humanity has finally made contact with aliens, um, and this is sort of before the final step towards opening up. That contact happens, where there's conflict between um, factions that worry about the consequences of that. And really, it's this is the first in a series, and it's to a large extent a lot of world building, and so I've used it's a relatively simple heist novel, really, in space, with you know somebody breaking into a space station and the consequences of that. That sort of helps as providing a backdrop for me to start exploring the setting, while hopefully providing a reasonably exciting story.
So would you say it's more of a sort of descriptive kind of book, if you like, rather than being more? Would you say it's more focused on the creative side of it and describing what the setting and that kind of thing, rather than the storyline? Obviously, storyline's
Well,
key as well, but
it is quite high paced, but it's not. It's more. I would say the setting is more important than the characters in this, especially in this first one. I think there is certainly a certain degree of building characters, but um, especially given that it's relatively a sort of hard sci-fi, a lot of it is focused on explaining how the setting, how the universe this is set in works, and setting up the factions while keeping a very high pace of action. So, I mean, the feedback I have so far, it is largely that, well, it's a really fast-paced action type story. But that is, again, I think largely because I focused on, well, what's happening and the world building more than the characters. Um, actually been surprised by how positive the feedback has been on the characters so far, because that is not something I expected to people to notice, because it's not, when I read sci-fi myself, I read it for the settings more than the characters, and so I didn't expect that I would get that kind of feedback on the characters, which was good.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that was a really positive thing for you to hear. Did
Yeah.
in terms of the feedback that you are getting, like you say that you're receiving feedback. Is it sort of feedback from people that you know, or is it feedback? Because obviously this is your first published book, if I'm
Yeah.
right in saying. So yeah, obviously when you first trying to build that reputation of being an author, it can be difficult to
It is.
to build sort of a readership, if you like. So is it people that you know already, or is it people who are buying the book and letting you know, or?
Yeah, it's been people have been buying the book, so it's been the initial reviews. Yeah, it's really hard building a reputation, and I mean, I approach this as a business and as a craft thing, as a more than art. To go back to what I said earlier, and for me, what's really important about that is that I went into this basically expecting nothing for the first couple of books. I'm expecting to make a loss after my cost of marketing this for the first 5, 6 books. So this is the first cycle of 6 books in what will be a much longer series. Um, I've actually planned out a rough outline for up to about 60 books.
Oh
Whether or
my
not I'll make
gosh.
it that far, I don't know. But my point with that is basically to treat this as a sort of a serial, a long running series with self-contained. I mean, the self-contained stopping points. So the first cycle is, as I said, 6 books. You can read. I'm aiming for you to be able to read each one of the novels independently if you want to. But then each 6 book cycle has a bigger story contained in it. But then it's also all driving towards a bigger sort of longer narrative, intentionally on the basis that as a self-published author, you don't have, nobody's spending £50,000 promoting your book. I've spent several £1,000s promoting my book so far, and it will take a while to earn that back. And I probably, I won't earn back what I've spent on the first book before my second book is published. The second book is probably going to be out in April or so. Um, and that's okay. I'm expecting to basically not earn anything on this. Probably make a loss for the first at least 3 or 4 books, maybe more, and then hopefully build up a readership based on that.
I suppose
Once
once you've got a once you've got a reputation, it is easier to gain on it, to build on it, isn't it? Obviously, when you're starting it, you first
yeah,
release the book, you've got no one's read it on the first day. Obviously,
yeah,
by after a year, 2 years, 3 years, once you've got a few books released, and you've got perhaps 100 readers or 1,000 readers, it's then
yeah,
much easier to grow that, because if just 10% of those people say, "Oh, you should read this book" to somebody else, then
yeah.
again you've got more and more people reading it. So it's sort of, in that respect, it's harder to get the first lot of it than it is to get the next amount of readers in, because you've then got a more reliable, trustworthy sort of fan base, if you like.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, I'm sure you're seeing the same thing, with your podcast, in that, well, every person who reads one book or watches one episode is somebody who might potentially move on and read the next book or watch the next podcast. And not all of them will, of course, uh, but with books, you're talking about read through for series, the number of people who goes on to read the next one, and that for me was a big factor in choosing to write the series, because it's easier to get a high degree of read through when there's actually a connection there, and there's a very clear, at the end of my first book, even though it is standalone in the sense that there is an ending, there is an epilogue that gives a hint of what comes next. And for me, that's very important in terms of both building the reader, the reader, the fan base, to put it that way, and to get give people an incentive to keep up with it.
Mm.
I basically assume that I'm going to lose money for a long time on bringing people in to read to do or to get their first novel, and that's, it will first be the ones that go on to read the second and third and so on that will actually start making this hopefully into something viable.
Yeah, but I mean that's okay. That's what you have to do. Sometimes you have to invest in yourself, don't you? I mean, if there's no big publisher going to invest for you, you need to do it yourself, effectively,
I think
and that's what you're
that
doing.
that's absolutely true, and you see, this is why it is so hard to get through the door for the publishers as well, because they need to know that they can put an enormous amount of money in behind a title for to get some really massive numbers now and again. But they too will lose money on a lot of the books they publish. They're basically, I mean, my day job is venture capital, and I've been doing startups basically my entire sort of commercial career, and our rule of thumb is that, well, most of the companies we invest in will go bankrupt, and that works for a fund, that works for an investor because you're investing in lots of different things, and it works for a publisher because they're publishing lots of books, and they need one breakout success for every 10 books or whatever, you know um, to make those bets work. But it doesn't work for the people who fail. So there's a very different strategy to take if you're looking to, if you're happy with sort of building up a reasonable fan base, and making a decent income from it, then your approach should probably be very different to somebody who um, would rather gamble on a massive return. And both approaches are okay. But if you know that you can do an okay job, and um, you can succeed without a big publisher. If you want to be the next sort of J.K. Rowling and become a billionaire, you pretty much don't have a choice. You need to go to a big publisher. But odds are you will get rejected several times, and you will not, get that to that point, because such a tiny, tiny little proportion um, get to that point. So you have to make a choice basically, whether or not you see this as I said, as a craft or as art, and whether or not you will want to do it slow and steady, and build up a fan base, and accept that it might take years before you start seeing returns from it, or whether or not you want to gamble. And it's a question of, well, do you want to turn this into something you can live off, potentially, or at least is a nice, side income, or do you want to, or do you sort of want it to make it big, and if you can make it big, you put it aside.
So it's kind of a toss up between either you get all or nothing, or you go for
Yeah,
the safer option and get sort of in the middle somewhere. So you're either going for that private island in the middle of nowhere and a jumbo jet, or you're going
yeah.
for being comfortable.
But to be clear, I mean, even most really successful writers, especially in genres like science fiction, get to that successful in the middle. And because the average income for a novelist is minimum wage, that kind of level. Because and that's of course because a huge proportion of people who write novels, they do it as a
Yeah.
sideline. But even of the people who do it full time, very very few become rich. It's not something to aim for if your goal is to be rich, really, because it's a really poor return on investment for most people. Um, you'd probably be better off picking pretty much any other profession and working a second job. But you pick this kind of thing because you enjoy doing it, and then the payoff, if you get it, is a nice bonus, and if you can manage to make a living out of it, it's great.
Yeah, I mean, totally. You said that you work as your full time job. You said you work in venture capital. Uh, so for anyone sort of listening, could you mind giving sort of a brief description of what that is? See, from what you've said, it's sort of it's high risk, high reward investment, or in that kind of
Yeah, I mean,
look at it, isn't it?
yeah, I mean, basically, my starting point was that I started my first company my first year of uni. Basically, I started an internet provider back in 1995. So,
Okay.
and I don't startup after startup initially, and to be honest, I earned some money from it. But that the main thing for me was that it was they were fun projects, and there was a potential for a big payout, but most people never get that big payout. The interesting part for me is that my biggest payouts from that has been from the most, the least exciting startups, put it that way. It's been when I've gotten shares in more conventional companies. And that was actually what brought me over to the UK as well. I grew up in Norway, but we started a company called Name Planet, which was a vanity email provider. You could get so basically your first name at your last name, dot whatever. And then we started the .name top level domain. So if you see any addresses with .name in them, that's that project. And we moved that company over to the UK in 2000 because we needed venture capital. We needed more than we could get from Norwegian funds at the time, and so we went to London. And so venture capital, that business basically is investing in high risk companies, in companies that can't go to the bank and get a loan because banks are very boring when it comes to what they will invest in. They will require you to be able to show a very clear and not least, they need to be able to see that you can get returns quickly. So a bank is good if you are going into something very traditional, like, well, you're opening a shop and you can show that there's this much footfall. And so you should be able to get the return, start seeing money back in the moment you open. A bank is not good if you're telling them that you have this great new app idea and it's going to take 3 years before you have any revenue and that kind of thing. So venture capital funds basically assume that there will be no income coming in the beginning. You haven't developed what you're talking about yet. You have no idea. And there's a whole, you go and you get some money to build out start developing. You go out and you get funding for another round once you have something ready to go to market, and so on. But it might easily take, 3, 5, even 10 years before you actually start making a profit. And so most of those companies will go bankrupt. It's just, nobody's that good at predicting the future, or everybody be doing it. And so our job basically is to find the best bets and get a spread that is good enough that we left with, at least a few winners that make back so much money that they can make up for all the losses.
Yeah, so it's the idea of spreading out your net as far and wide as you can, and hoping to get something back from it. If you're fishing, for example, you put it out as far and wide as you can and hope that something catches on and hope something works in that way. You obviously not more than just a hope. It's not it's not just going in willy nilly for anything. It's obviously you have to look into each individual case.
It's actually a very tough business because the people who do go out and just hope and spread their money around, they will not make a profit. Because there's so many bad ideas out there that you do need to filter very aggressively. And so actually part of my job in that respect is to build tools to help filter and to help manage that kind of thing. So that's my day job.
It's like a
And
measured risk. You know it's a risk, but it's one that you're willing to take because it may turn out all right. It's not it's not
exactly,
investing in someone
uh,
who's looking at selling a bag of air. You know, it's for example they're not doing something that everyone
well,
else is doing as well. So, you know,
so part of the job is to filter out the people who do try to sell a bag of air, because
yeah,
there are those out there. I mean, there's plenty of them out there that have ideas that are either intentional scams, or where they just don't understand that their idea is really really awful. The problem is that sometimes they are convincing, and
yes.
sometimes they have built something that looks like it is more than a bag of air, but it turns out when you start digging into it that there's not really that much there.
And some people have
And
that gift to just to talk and convince people and persuade people. So it's within your remit to try and work out the truths from the falsities, I guess.
yes, exactly. I mean, it is, and it is in a sense. I mean, pulling this back to, it's very similar to what the publishing industry has to deal with, because they're also in a sense doing the same thing. A lot of their acceptances, for example, is based on people querying on the basis they've written a few chapters, and obviously they can go. The publishers can go and say, come back to us when you have a finished manuscript. But by then, the really, really fantastic ones might be gone. They might have gotten a contract with somebody else, so they can't afford to always do that. And it's a tricky one, because sometimes you might also get things in that looks really rough, but there's something there. And so you want to you want there to be multiple. You spend a lot of effort in filtering, and it's a perpetual problem for any kind of industry where you're trying to filter out, I think. And in a sense, that having worked in that environment is sort of part of what shaped my approach, my thoughts on what I wanted to do with my writing as well. Because um, when I was when I was writing my first horrible draft of something, I was very much seeing it as an art thing, and I would have been, I would have spent, if I had continued, I would have spent years on getting everything perfect the way I saw it, and it probably would have still been awful. Whereas when I started looking at this again, my inspiration actually was very much sort of pulp series. It's actually specifically, there's a Western, a Norwegian Western series, novels that I read when I was a kid, that sort of I got thinking about as an idea. And the reason for that was that the author of that, he was writing in a pen name, Louis Masterson, and he published about 100 novels. And he sold more than 20 million copies before any of his works was translated to English.
Oh
They're
wow.
translated about 20 other languages. But when you started digging into the numbers, you realize that the average sales numbers for his novels were never particularly big. Each translation, each translation of each novel on average sold something like 10 to 20,000 copies, which is, for something being published in a niche language like Norwegian is decent, but it's not fantastic. And it worked for him because of basically building a fat fan base over a long period of time.
Hmm.
And so when he took a long break after he sort of finished his first big series, and then he started publishing again. The first edition of the sort of first of his last 6-book cycle was printed up in 100,000 copies in Norwegian alone.
Oh wow.
And 100,000 copies for a market of 5 million is quite a lot. And everybody was laughing at him and was thinking there's no way he's going to sell that much, and it was sold out in weeks, because he had spent those intervening at that point intervening 30 years basically building up a fan base.
And that's the sort of the dedication and
Yeah.
the method that he's used, which I guess in a way you're trying to not replicate, but base your ideas on, base your method on as well.
Yeah, and part of it is realizing that there is very little difference between spending 5 years on a novel and spending 5 months on a novel, because at some point, the what I realized was that, well, I could spend 5 years and just try to get everything perfect, but there's diminishing return there very, very quickly. What I realized was that when I first started on what became the novel that I now published, um, when I got stuck, I spent ages dealing with something that, when I started looking back at it, made no sense. There's no point in spending that much of time dealing with it, because nobody would notice, and nobody has mentioned any of that stuff. Because what I was obsessing over was tiny little details about how this space station that the heist in his novel, the robbery in his novel is set on, would function. That, I'm sure somebody will comment on it at some point. But if I have enough people reading it that somebody is starts dissecting it to that extent, I'll be very happy.
You know,
Um,
I'm sure it's it's the idea that, you know, because you're the one that's written it, because you spent all the time reading and rereading it, you notice it. But when
yeah,
someone reads it and they one page at a time finish the book, and then they won't touch it again for a little while, they're not going to notice it the first time. So I guess in a way it's the perfectionism that you were trying to achieve.
exactly. So you need to. I think one of the things, and this is one of the things that I've sort of also taken with me from my career in sort of tech and software development, being that, well, if you're doing a startup, actually I had lengthy discussions with this over the last few years with respect to software development, because I've been dealing with an agency that was doing outsourced work. And there's a very, very distinct difference in approach by people who have worked in startups and people who have done software development in more traditional settings. And the thing you learn very quickly with the startup is that you cannot afford to make things perfect, because what you're learning very quickly is that, well, if you're not making money, um, what you need to realize is that the money that you're spending today is a lot more expensive to you than the money that you will be spending a year from now, because the whole point is that you want to build value as quickly as you possibly can, so that you can go out and raise more money on a higher valuation. So the money that you're spending today might have cost you 10% of your company. The money that you're spending, a year from now, the same amount in pounds might cost you 1% of your company if you manage to build enough value. So you want to do as little as you can initially. Basically, you want to decide on, well, how little can I get away with doing? And you need to build something that's good enough. You need to write a novel that's good enough. But trying to get it perfect very, very quickly gets to the point where it's too expensive. And it's more important to publish that novel and start getting feedback, start getting readers, and start getting fans, and move on to the next one. And so I actually spent less than 2 months writing that novel when I sat down again the second time. And I wrote the draft to the second one, which I'm editing at the moment, in less than a month. And I will be experimenting with exactly what's the right amount of time and how many passes I should do with editing and so on. But what I saw was that when I went back with editing, the returns were diminishing very, very quickly. And so the exact amount of time that is right to spend for different people will be very different. I mean, some people may not, they will need a year or 2 years to finish a novel. But I also know that the author, for example, that I mentioned, at his peak, he was writing a novel a month, and they were publishing a novel a month. Obviously, there'd be a gap there. He'd finish one, and it goes to the editors and proofreaders and so on. But he would start writing the second one right away, and he would churn out short novels. To be fair, I mean short ones, but probably 40 to 50,000 words uh, in a month and get them to a point where once they've been through the proofreaders and the editing stuff, they were ready. So it's possible. Some people do churn out 12 novels a year. And it really depends on the genre, because some genres are more forgiving of that kind of thing than others. And things like that, which was a sort of pulpy western, and things like romance are very much more forgiving of that. People care more about there being a next one in the series than it being perfect. Sci-fi is a little bit in between. I think it depends on the type of sci-fi. If you're looking for something that is very novel and very innovative, people expect more complexity and bigger page count and that kind of thing. So I
Someone wants
lean
to be engrossed by any book, but by a sci-fi book, you want to you want to use it almost as an escape from reality, because that's what it is. So you want to be
yeah,
totally engaged with it.
but there's a surprising even to me who's been reading sci-fi all my life. There's a surprising number of subgenres with very specific different ideas about what is right. And you will find sort of high concepts sci-fi where people expect there to be big reveals and that kind of thing. But then on the other hand, you have things like space opera and military sci-fi, stuff like that, where it's more you are expecting drama and action in space more than you're expecting big reveals and really fantastical elements. So if you're looking at, I would say the comparison would be between things like Star Wars, which leans heavily towards the space opera and fantasy side of things, versus Star Trek, which is much more. You expect each episode of a Star Trek series to have some sort of twists. Um, and so I'm leaning more in this case towards the sort of adventure type setting, but more science than Star Wars. So I would say closer to something like Expanse is a good example of hard sci-fi that's also adventure, much more than it is sort of high concept, and that's the kind of audience I'm aiming for, basically. Somebody who wants the action and adventure, but also want it to be at least somewhat plausible. Wants the details to be, if not perfect, then at least somewhat relevant. I mean, to the point where I've, looked up, used calculators, calculated to get the spin and get the relative gravity right of the space stations and that kind of things, because I know some people will check. Uh, but at the same time, I'm not trying to sort of come up with some big aha moment for people where it's all, ooh, this is mind bending as much. I write some short stories as well that I publish on my website, and they're more experimental in that respect, and more trying to make people think. Um, but for novels, they're much more straightforward adventures set in a sci-fi setting.
That's wonderful. It's really nice to hear your perspective on this kind of thing, and I think some of the key things that we can sort of pick out from what you've said, especially what you mentioned about the difference between whether something is an art or a craft. It's like the idea of business and pleasure. It's are you doing something for a purpose to gain something financial or professionally out of it, or are you doing it to gain something personally enjoyable out of it, or is it sort of a mix in between? So I think as myself and as a listener to this episode, I think we can all take away from that something we can relate to our own lives, and perhaps something that we're trying to achieve or accomplish is, are we doing it for a business reason or a pleasure or a craft or an art? And I think that can really help you decipher in your own mind how you go about approaching whatever that might be.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it is, and to be clear, I mean, some people think that if you're saying that it's a craft that is, you're looking down on it. It's not that at all. I purposefully made that choice. Of course, there's a different trade-offs. You cannot afford to spend or to put as much effort into a single work if you're treating it as a craft. Because the point is, you set yourself a standard, and you want to meet it, and you want that standard to be as high as possible. But you're purposefully trying to set a standard that makes it possible for you to produce consistently. And the upshot of that is that hopefully you can deliver more to people. And I purposefully, I mean, the reason that I took that approach as well was because a lot of the stuff that I've been reading has been written very much as a craft, as in it's been written intentionally within constraints where somebody wanted to write lots, in the case of this series that I mentioned as inspiration. But I also read lots of stuff that is very much written by perfectionists. I mean, I think the sort of the perfect counterpoint to this Western series that I mentioned would be something like Franz Kafka, for example, which he published almost nothing while he was alive because it didn't meet his standards. Most of the works that have been published of Kafka were stuff that he handed over to a friend of his, Max Brod, uh, and his testament basically told Max Brod to burn it all. And the reason that we have works like America, for example, by Kafka, is that Broad didn't listen and ensure that everything got published instead. And on one hand, I can understand the feeling. There's lots of stuff that I've written that I would never want anybody to see. I don't think any of it is of the quality of the stuff that Kafka wrote. But there's I wanted to make sure that when I decided to write again, I wrote stuff that would actually get out there and get read. And it's more important for me to set a bar that is something I can meet, and make things good enough that I feel like I can publish it. Than it is to sort of keep on polishing something that might, that I'll never be happy with.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting point of view because a lot of people, well, I say a lot of people, some people may say that when you're starting out with something, you got to make sure everything's right and you've got a good base to start off with. But what you're saying is not the opposite of that, but it's a very different way of looking at it. It's got to be consistent, and if your first thing that you create is the best one, then it's just going to go sort of downhill from there almost. If you're setting the bar too high, you can't be consistent in that way, and people will be disappointed with the next one, perhaps.
I think if you set the bar too high, you might never ever get it out there in the first place. I mean, it is a lot of stuff that we get that is fantastic would never ever get out there if the creator of it has set the aim of producing something perfect.
Yes, yes.
There's space for both. I mean, a lot of really fantastic works only exist because the people who wrote them did set out to make something that was just absolutely the best they could possibly do, and didn't stop until they got there. But on the other hand, a lot of works are only exist as well because people have decided that they are doing something that needs to get out, and it's more important to get it out than to keep on polishing for years and years.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very interesting point to that there's two very contrasting views to it, and neither is right and neither is wrong. It's just down to the individual that's doing the writing to decide whether they think it's something that they want to spend years on to perfect to the T, or if it's something that they want to create to a good quality and then get it out and then move on to the next thing. And I think either whichever you choose, is totally a personal decision. And obviously for yourself at this time, you've chosen to start with getting a good quality book and trying to get it out there, rather than getting a perfect every word and every punctuation mark is exact. As opposed to doing that, you're getting yourself out there, which is very necessary when you're at the start of a journey like this.